Welcome to Sam's Russian Adventures, and welcome to a snowy winter overcast day in Russia. Today is going to be a little bit of a different type of video. Now, usually I don't do political videos at all. It's not my thing. If I do anything political, then it's usually asking Russians, people's opinions of things going on. As a YouTuber, I know how dangerous it is to create content that YouTube could consider pro-Russian content, because YouTube has a policy with regards to the content that creators can make with regards to the Russia-Ukraine conflict, and usually it only enforces that rule and these rules, I guess, or these terms when it comes to Russian citizens. So if you're making that content in the US, you're kind of okay. You can, you'll see interviews that are very pro-Russian on channels by Americans, but if it's Russian citizens, then it's very dangerous to create any type of content that YouTube could consider pro-Russian or anti the narrative that the West has created, and therefore it's very difficult. Now, obviously, everyone's talking, the whole world is talking right now about Tucker Carlson being in Moscow to interview Sergei Lavrov, and I've got my opinions about that, so I want to share them today. I've just watched the interview with Sergei Lavrov. Honestly, I didn't learn that much new, because that is the Russian narrative, that is the Russian side of things, and I know that side of things. I've seen that side of things so many times. Am I allowed to say whether I agree with it or not? I do. Now, does that put my channel at risk? I hope not. All I'm doing is being honest and sharing my ideas and sharing my, I guess, my opinion. Hopefully I'm allowed to have this opinion. Now, the way I see this whole, Tucker Carlson coming to Moscow and interviewing Sergei Lavrov, of course it's great. It's great because it brings attention. It's great because somebody finally from the West, from Western media, is coming to Russia to interview Russian president he interviewed, and now the Russian foreign minister, because it's great to have that dialogue. We should have that dialogue. Typically, no one interviews Russian politicians, the Russian president. That doesn't happen, because they know that that information is then going to go on to the mainstream media. And if that information goes onto the mainstream media, then it can't be good for them, because they're going to say things that are different to the narrative that the Western media portrays about Russia as a general, as a whole, and of course about the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Now, of course, Tucker Carlson has come to interview Sergei Lavrov, and he's interviewed Vladimir Putin. But unfortunately, Tucker Carlson is also portrayed as just this kind of like pro-Russian Kremlin propagandist, and so when he says things, the rest of the mainstream media are just going to say Tucker Carlson's probably being paid by the Kremlin, has come to Moscow to help spread and sprout Kremlin propaganda. And unfortunately, that's how it's going to be seen throughout the most of the world. They'll probably show it on mainstream media that the Kremlin propagandist has come to Russia to spread this propaganda. And it's really unfortunate, right? Because therefore everyone that watches Tucker Carlson after that is going to say, oh, I'm probably just going to watch it to see what crazy propaganda he comes out with, right? I'm sure he must have been paid to create this whole thing, And it really is a shame. There's so many people that think Vladimir Putin just woke up one morning and thought, I'm going to invade Ukraine because I hate them. And oh yeah, that's another one. Another really popular one is they're the bread basket. We need more food in Russia, right? We haven't got enough, land in Russia. We need to invade Ukraine because we need their land to create this food. Another thing that the Western media does, and Western politicians, they're very good at comparing Vladimir Putin to Hitler. Because if you compare someone to Hitler, and you do it repeatedly over and over and over again, then people are going to say, yeah, Vladimir Putin is just Hitler. Yeah, he just wants to invade. He needs to recreate the Soviet Union. That's the narrative that so many people put, because they don't want to show the real narrative, the real truth towards the whole thing, because of course that's going to make them look bad. And at the same time, what the Western media is very good at doing is ignoring anything that any of the Western countries that have done that's even slightly similar to Russia, because that's just called whataboutism. Whataboutism is this thing that they've created to basically say we can do what we want whenever we want, right? And we don't care, and there's never going to be any consequences to that. And if you do something that we don't agree with and you say, well, what about that thing that we did? We're just going to say, hey, whoa, whoa, whoa. That's whataboutism. And that's just such a crazy thing. It's really, really crazy. It's like, basically, there's going to be double standards. We're going to do way worse than you, but we're not going to get punished in any way for it. But if you dare to bring that up in the future, we're just going to say, that's whataboutism. And that's the end of it. So a few weeks ago, when Donald Trump became president of the United States, or won the election, I made a video about, you know, him winning, and I walked around and asked Russian people their opinions. And the majority of the people that watched the video, they're not my typical audience. They're Americans who I guess were just on YouTube and searching for maybe Russians' opinions about Donald Trump, and they found my video. And I got so many comments saying it's so good that Donald Trump has won the election because Russia and America can now be friends, right? They're now going to be friends. Yeah, I think that's a bit far-fetched, and I'm going to tell you why that is. Because America has done so much to harm Russia and the Russian economy and the Russian image. And, you know, it's pretty crazy to expect that now they're going to be friends. It's just going to be like, it's almost like, yeah, you know, I had sex with your wife, I killed your family, I burned your house down, I, you know, took everything from your bank, and now, yeah, let's forget it and carry on. You know, that's not going to happen. That is not going to happen. So what is the Russian narrative? Why do Russians see things completely different to the way that Western politicians and Western media see things? Why do they talk about this whole conflict with Ukraine as just being this thing that Vladimir Putin, for no reason, just decided that, you know, he's a horrible person and wants to go and do? Why does it differ so much? Well, let me run through just a quick overview, coming from me, not coming from Tucker Carlson. Hopefully some more people will see this. I guess a lot of them are just going to say, yeah, this is I'm paid by the Kremlin or whatever to say this stuff. But first of all, it's all about NATO enlargement, right? Soviet Union finished, NATO promised, right? The USA promised that NATO would not be expanded, and then suddenly NATO is every country in Europe apart from Russia, basically, right? Virtually every country in Europe. Imagine, I don't know, the UK, right? Imagine the UK is the UK, and then every other country in Europe is in the Russian alliance. How would the UK feel? Would the UK feel scared? Would the UK feel like it was suffocated? Would the UK feel like, wow, this is really crazy, like everyone's kind of against us, right? Would it feel weird? How would you feel if you're in the UK and then suddenly, you know, Scotland said, you know what, we want to join NATO too? How would England feel? Would they feel threatened? Would they feel scared to know that Russian weapons could then be placed into Scotland? Russian rockets could be placed on the border with England. How would England feel, right? So I remember in 2014 there was a big decision to be made by the president of Ukraine. Should he sign a contract to move closer and stay closer ties with Russia, or should he do the changes and make the changes they had to make in order to potentially join the EU? And the president chose closer ties with Russia because otherwise Ukraine would have been bankrupt. They would have been bankrupt. They could not afford to make those changes to infrastructure, changes to the economy, so much stuff that they would have had to do. And I remember saying to my dad, this isn't going to go down well, but they did talk about it in the Western media before it happened, that the president doesn't have a choice. Now, little did we know that the US, at that point we weren't aware, right, but the US sponsored a coup in Ukraine in 2014 to overthrow the government. Pretty crazy, right? Now this is all out there, the evidence is all there. There's audio recording of this, of American officials talking about this, saying that, you know, they paid to have this revolution, to create this revolution to overthrow the government. And it's pretty crazy. And then talking about the amounts of money that they are prepared to invest to basically hand pick the new Ukrainian government. And that is insane, right? But that isn't shown in the Western media. That is not shown, even though it's out there, it exists. That narrative is not shown. And then of course the Russian speakers in the East, well, they were like, well, we're not having any of this, we don't want to be a part of this. So what happened? They were like, no, we don't accept this, we don't accept this scenario, we feel closer to Russia. So what happened? The Ukrainian government said, well, we're not having that. They started passing laws saying, you know, we don't want to allow Russian language to be taught in schools, we don't want to have these closer ties to Russia. And they started persecuting these people, and then they started a mini internal conflict against the people living in the Donbass and living in the East, the Russian speakers. Now this again really was not shown on Western media at all, and this lasted for a while until they signed contracts, peace deals with Russia. So they signed these peace deals to say there'll be no more shelling, there'll be no more of this happening, right? But what happened? They carried on doing it. They carried on. It's crazy, right? And this carried on for, well, from 2014 to 2020. Even though they had peace accords, the Minsk peace accords were signed to say that there wouldn't be any more killing and persecuting of these ethnic Russians. Imagine this was the UK, and in Scotland lived, you know, lots of English speaking people around the border. And Scotland started persecuting. Scotland said no more English. Obviously they speak the same language, but could compare it to Northern Ireland, right? There's that part of Ireland, Northern Ireland, with the English speakers in, and it's still part of the UK. They're not saying, well, give it back to Ireland. No, this is English speakers and Protestant people that want to be part of the UK. But when Russia did that, when Russia recognized these people's right to speak Russian and have close ties with Russia because that's who they feel, well, that was completely unallowed. That's awful. How could Russia support these people, right? And so because of these reasons, this has led to the full-scale conflict that we have today. Now obviously this stuff does not get shown in the media at all. In fact, they just say that Russia's this mean, horrible country that for no reason whatsoever just decided to invade Ukraine because apparently Putin is Hitler, or perhaps they want the Ukrainian farmland. And then imagine that after that, like the whole of these NATO countries go and sanction Russia. The gas market that Russia had, where Russia basically was selling huge amounts of gas to Europe, well, that got taken over by the Americans. The pipeline that the Russians built with Germany and with another couple of countries involved, well, that was heavily sanctioned from the word go. Heavily sanctioned. And America were determined to sanction any company or country that were prepared to help build the pipeline. And that was suspiciously sabotaged by nobody. They blamed the Ukrainians, apparently came out in a little boat like a canoe or something and blew it up. But we all know who it was, and we all know why it was blown up. And now obviously the United States has taken over the European gas market, selling liquid gas to countries for a lot more money. So Russia lost its gas market. Russia became heavily sanctioned. The media has completely trashed Russia, and Russia had to, well, look east for new partners in order to survive, in order to grow again. And then suddenly now Russia are going to say, well, we're going to just forget everything if a new president comes in? Is that really likely? Is that going to happen? Now, something else that a lot of the world do not know, or perhaps maybe know a little bit, but are refusing to accept it. But literally a month after the full-scale conflict started, there was a peace deal on the table that Ukraine were ready to sign, that in theory everything was fine. Obviously it was like a draft of a peace deal, and then Boris Johnson turned up and told Ukraine not to sign the peace deal, even though Ukraine were ready to sign, Russia were ready to sign. They said, do not sign the peace deal, carry on, we're going to support you, you're going to win the war. And so 2 years later, more than 2 years, 2.5 years later, here we are, death, destruction, absolute nightmare. And this all could have been solved on so many occasions. But you can see now that NATO enlargement, that the coup in Ukraine, sponsored by the US, that Boris Johnson telling Ukraine not to sign a peace deal, has led to the stage where we are now. And so a lot of the world think of it as just Russia just doing bad. But there's been so many occasions of separate peace deals on the table to stop this thing. But there you go. The world thinks that Russia is just this evil country that's decided just to invade for no reason. And when you see it the way it actually is, rather than the way the media portrays it, it looks completely different, right? Completely different. It's pretty scary to even realize how it is. Now, obviously it's awful. War is awful. People dying is awful. But the opportunities we've had to solve this have been so many. But the West have not wanted to solve it. The West have wanted this war. So here we are now, 2.5 years later. The chance of nuclear war is a realistic chance, because just imagine, again, let's go back to the UK as an example. Imagine that Russia and all Russia's allies sending weapons to Scotland to bomb the UK, to bomb England. What would England do in that scenario? Imagine, and if we just look at the Cuban Missile Crisis, right? In the Soviet Union, the Soviets were sending rockets and missiles to Cuba, and the world was in complete outrage. How dare they send these weapons and put these weapons basically on America's back door? How dare they do that? It was seen as a complete scandal, a complete outrage, and the Soviet Union were pushing for nuclear war, right? Absolutely, you know, nightmare. How dare they do that? But when the US and all of the NATO countries are sending all these weapons to Ukraine, that's completely fine. That's no problem at all. That's, well, what's the problem, right? And it's just crazy double standards to think that when it was USSR doing it, right, it was awful. When America does it, what's Russia's problem? And so here we are right now at this stage where we have the potential of an escalating war that's could have been solved so many times, so many occasions this could have been solved. But it doesn't seem that the NATO countries were in any, had any desire to solve this problem. They probably thought, war with Russia, that's great. Now, obviously we all know that there's a leader of NATO. We all know who that country is, and all the other countries follow what that country says. And so now we're waiting for the new president of that country to decide what's going to happen next, and it's going to be an interesting step. But I'm not expecting anything dramatic. I'm not expecting huge changes, because there's so much happened already that it's going to be very difficult to just kind of say, oh, let's stop it now. A lot of people are saying, so now there's going to be a peace deal, right? There's going to be a peace deal. There's going to be a ceasefire, everything's going to be fine. Well, I can tell you now that a ceasefire is not something that Russia are going to be interested in. So I've seen a lot of people say, why don't we create a buffer zone and have a contract to say that Ukraine can't join NATO for 20 years. Well, won't that just allow Ukraine 20 years to rearm, to build up its forces, and then to start the war again in 20 years time? Surely that's all it's doing, it's postponing it. Russia will want guarantees, and those guarantees are that Ukraine will never be a part of NATO, that NATO weapons cannot be in Ukraine. You have to look at this from Russia's perspective. Every country in Europe is part of NATO. That's crazy. That is just insane. Like, so all the countries that surround Russia are part of a defensive alliance that do not attack, they just defend. Well, I can't remember them ever defending anyone, but I can remember them attacking loads of countries that they decide need to be attacked. They have overthrown governments, right? They've attacked so many countries, I can't remember them being very defensive. So if you look at it from Russia's point of view, they need guarantees that Ukraine will not ever join NATO, that they will never have any of these NATO weapons in their country, that they're never going to be sponsored by NATO countries, right? That they're never going to have, that they're never going to have armed forces from NATO countries in their country. Yes, there can be some sort of, I guess, other countries involved in this peace deal, but it can't be NATO countries, because they are the countries that that this whole conflict has started because of. So to think that Russia is now going to say, let's have a peace deal, everything's going to be fine, and you can put NATO soldiers in Ukraine to keep the peace. I mean, that's just mental. So anyway, what do I think of Tucker Carlson coming to interview Lavrov? Well, I guess it's good in the fact that it brings attention to the truth, even if Western media won't portray it as the truth. Perhaps it's going to give Tucker Carlson more of a, even more hated, I guess, than he is right now. And people are going to say, yeah, he's definitely being paid by the Kremlin. But if one more person can learn the truth because of this, then that's a good thing, right? Now, at the same time, I understand that I'm going to get loads of hate in this video. How dare I? How I'm committing treason? How I'm, you know, a traitor to the United Kingdom. I'm not a traitor. I'm just telling you the facts, how it is. Now, everyone's going to have their own opinions about this, but the things that I've talked about in this video are facts, and you might not want to believe that, but there's evidence for all of the things that I've talked about. So if you go and research those things, you'll find that these are facts. So, you know, leave your comment below. Let me know what you think. I'm not really this kind of person that does this political stuff. So let me know your thoughts, and yeah, in the next video I'll go back to just walking around Russia and speaking to people. Maybe I'll get out there and I'll see if Russian people have seen this interview and ask them their opinions about it all. Maybe that'll be more interesting for you than an old man walking around his neighborhood rambling about political stuff. Okay, see you in the next video. Take care.